Hi everybody, very warm welcome to you this evening. My name's Stephen McGonigal. I'm one of the trustees of London Transport Museum Friends, and I'm very excited to be introducing today's talk. More about that in a second. I've got to give you some of the housekeeping first of all. Fire escapes, just in case they're needed, there's one just over here and one at the back where you came in. Also, please do ensure you switch your mobile phones off if you haven't done so already, or at least put them to silent. Okay, just to let you know also, we've got a number of talks coming up. We are looking to have Tony Williamson from McGill's Buses join us on the 12th of May. He's a very, very busy man, so we're just waiting to finalise that for sure. But in the next 72 hours or so, we'll get that confirmed to you. If not, Paul, who we're going to meet shortly, has offered to step in with some more interesting background, so we'll update you on that. Also coming up on the 9th of June, Richard Steddle, the High Commissioner of Malta, is going to join to have Richard Steddle talk about the 100th anniversary of buses on the island of Gozo and buses from London in Malta. 8th of September sees David Leader, Managing Partner of Transport Investment, talking about his experiences and views on TfL. And then going forward, we have Barry Carr from the British Transport Films Moving Image talk on the 13th of October. Luke Agbiamoni, a tube mapper, on 10th of November, and Professor Peter White joins on 8th of December. So there is a lot of fantastic talks coming up. Before that, I'm very excited to be introducing today's speaker. Most excited because as a bona fide East Ender of 25 years, I've lived on the Docklands Light Railway routes for quite some time. Today we'll be hearing from Paul Ebbutt on his personal reflections of the Docklands Light Railway from 1983 to 1989. Paul was one of two civil engineering graduates that joined London Transport back in 1977 and spent the next 40 years nearly with the organisation. He's worked on the London Heathrow Terminal 4 extension, the Elizabeth Line or Crossrail, private partnership, and most recently as a senior client engineer on the Northern Line's Battersea extension. In addition, Paul worked on the original London Transport project team delivering the Docklands Light Railway and also supported the DLR Operations team. So without further ado, please welcome Paul.
Thank you very much. I've just got to turn this thing on. He says. Oh, that didn't work. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me, Mother? There we are. It's before my time, that one. Right. Okay, so Paul Ebbutt, thanks. Lovely to be here. And we're going to quick canter through my experience in the DLR from the early 80s. I've got one or two notes here. So I've got a couple of people to thank for supporting you. I'll get the adverts out of the way first. So I must say that this book by Jonathan Willis, who's in the audience today, has been excellent in filling in the gaps before I started on the DLR, so I can't emphasise more, and that also covers some other railways I've had bits and pieces to do with. And John, it's reminded me of some little aspects of my career that I didn't know. So we'll find out about that as I go through. So thanks very much. I'm going to talk a bit about the background to the docks construction, just touch on that, rail options between London Transport and the GLC, and then we're going to go looking at a thing called the LDDC. What was that? And then something, this is when we're really going to get into the interesting stuff. It's all personal and no sort of opinions of London Transport, okay, but we're going to start talking about contract strategy, which I might have some opinions about, a little bit of sniff about construction, and as the railway was built. When I first gave this talk, it was about an hour and a half, so I've had to pare it right down. But we're going to have some anecdotes. I think we need to go. It's my USP of building and working on the Docklands Light Railway. So I think we need to get through to that really to get the maximum benefit of my time with you today. So right, Docklands Light Railway. Personal view: was it worth it? Oh, there we go. That's a bad start. Now what have I done? Right, so a big change from that to that. And I say to you, the Docklands Light Railway may just have helped. You'll find out what I think about that as we go on. So London docks are key, couple of crib notes I need to make here at the very beginning so to get it right. So it's interesting that the first enclosed dock was the West India Dock in London. 1802 that was opened. I'm not going to go into history of docks, it's a really good read. I used to lecture about the Docklands Light Railway in the 1980s and had a lot more slides about. Oh, some of the slides, by the way, are from the original slides I used in the 1980s. So hence the quality could be better. This is one of them. So I just pushed up my skill set by copying them digitally, but that bad. So 1802, William Jessup was the civil engineer for construction. I've got notes on who painted this, but you can look it up online if you want to. So, but really contrast this, and always intrigued me how Liverpool had opened enclosed secure docks in 17, quick, where is it? 1715. Wow, look at that difference. 1715 Liverpool, London 1802. Anyway, there we are. Lots of other docks were built following on from that. And then, so the London docks, this end, hopefully the pointer's working. London docks, the Surrey docks, the Royal docks came stages later. But the key thing was the PLA was formed to sort of pull these together and manage investment and recovery, really, of some of the aspects. 1909, the PLA formed, and brings stability and improvements, as the notes, that's good. And of course, a key role in recovery after the war. So that's quite an interesting thing. And then on notes, it's interesting to note that trade was peaking in the early 60s, 1961 it says. So I thought it's quite interesting. So still building with trade and recovery, sort of post-war, still building trade in 1961. I don't personally remember it because I used to live in North Kent. There you go. But then it progressively started to close and quite run down, and quite quickly after that in the 70s. And the key thing, you can read up the history, I'm sure you get other speakers about that, which you might want to do, is that it was containerisation was the sort of trigger to the rundown of the docks. And of course, something missing on here, PLA, Tilbury docks. All right, and Tilbury docks was where the PLA focused their investment for managing container traffic. Bigger ships needed with containers, and see the size of some of them to this day. Of course, they wouldn't come further up the Thames, and the space needed for handling containers. So farewell West India docks, which of course is here. Farewell London docks and others, and they started to run down. Okay, and progressive closure until the early 80s. So that's quite interesting. So that's really all I'm going to say about the docks. But of course, with progressive closure and rundown, people were starting to worry about what to do with the areas. Now, there's quite a lot of background in John Willis's book, which I recommend. I'm going to try and summarise it. This is one of my old slides, and so it doesn't quite copy well, but I hope you can see that okay. So there was originally London Transport's Fleet Line as one of two priority sort of tube lines that emerged from a 1940s review that was done, as I understand it. Interestingly, during the war, there was already a review going on about how to recover London. That's quite interesting, I found. And there were two sort of north-south lines being looked at as tube lines and lots of other railway lines, as I understand it. One of them, of course, came out as a priority, the Victoria Line, constructed in the 60s. And the second one as a priority, so Victoria Line was sort of northeast, so northeast across to southwest, but actually south, wasn't it? And eventually deviated to Brixton. And then another one went to northwest to southeast, which was and they followed the sort of course of the Fleet River, so that was sort of termed at the time the Fleet Line. Okay, they were merged as the priorities. So following on from construction of the Victoria Line, parliamentary powers, so in those days parliamentary powers were the way of going forward. Not going to go into detail about that. They were achieved for the construction of stage 1 of the Fleet Line. So stage 1 was to Charing Cross. So this was a sort of paralleling the Bakerloo line to ease capacity, Charing Cross. Stage 2 was going on to Fenchurch Street, and again, powers were later got for that. And stage 3 was down here to southeast London and Lewisham, and even options going down to Hayes and Addiscombe on taking over some Southern Railway lines. Okay, that was the concept. Nothing to do with me, but it was interesting that was going on. So, just check my notes. So. Now, it was also early 70s, so the GLC could obviously see that the Docklands were winding down, and in the early 70s, as I understand it, the GLC started thinking about let's do something to service Docklands, okay? So that's when they started thinking about this thing called perhaps the River Line. Stop go, and they were hoping to get this sort of straight investment to Fenchurch Street, and there was quite a high confidence it would carry on to Fenchurch Street, to the extent that they also had some enabling funding for looking after property rights, and who knew this? There's a tunnel down here somewhere that's been built in the sort of south side of the river. They developed a special tunnelling machine for use in the water-bearing materials down here, which of course would have been a benefit for the Jubilee line later on, slurry machines and things like that. I could talk for the rest of the day on tunnelling, but I'm not going to, you'll be pleased to know. But apparently there is, so it's gone on my to-do list. Having reminded myself that tunnel was there, is to get in that tunnel somewhere around here. So anyone knows where that is, let me know. We can talk about that later. But so 180 metres of tunnel was built under the enabling works package for the for what was the sort of river line and fleet line in those days. So just bear with me a minute. So and a safeguarding budget. So okay. So then beyond that. I think I just must have missed something up there. That there was, bear with me. There were, in the early 70s as well, because the costs of tube line was always a bit of a sort of a challenge, that's the word, and it was constantly recognised that a tube line was best for growth, but they were looking, the GLC were looking at low capacity options, and there was a famous Travers Morgan 1973 report. I've never seen it. Would be interested to read it. But they were looking at lower capacity rail options. But all conclusions at that time were tube's best. People don't want to change modes. Okay, so onwards then to the next key mode, really. David Bayliss at the GLC leading this, which is a sort of GLC Department of Environment report, the London Rail Study, not just about the Fleet Line, River Line, looking at lots of rail issues around London. But as I understand it, the River Line piece with the Jubilee Line emerged as the preferred tube extension and option. So, and not Lewisham. It appears at this stage that the Lewisham New Cross bit was completely sort of abandoned. So powers were being acquired to get down to the sort of Surrey Docks area here. So we had stage 2, powers were being acquired to get down here as well. And LT was authorised to progress some river. 1978. Now I started work with TfL in 1977. So in 1978 they were empowered to do some enabling works, and lo and behold, who was working on a borehole contract in 1978? Little did I know that it was this borehole contract, and I was just as a graduate supporting Dick Bliss, who was in our construction team at that time. Oh, so it was that job I was working on for the boreholes. So thanks for the prompt, that's A to John there in his book. That was really, really helpful. Not only that, but there was a priority in those days to actually enhance the North Woolwich line as well. So we had North Woolwich station around here and the link to Stratford. Everyone remember that? All right. That was sort of a cheap sort of upgrade was to continue the third rail, Conrail as I like to call it, down to North Woolwich. And I remember that happening. And when I went back into the design office in 1978, lo and behold, I was working on just getting out to tender a tunnel job here. A tunnel job there, and we were doing I remember folding the yes, we had to fold drawings in those days, hundreds of them, so all the tenderers, and there are folding drawings for this job about to go to tender, and this of course is a period of time around, it must have been about 1979, because it was again one of the task jobs that was stopped by the new Tory administration, as I understand it, and that job, drawings were taken right up to tender for this tunnel job. I was actually helping with it, and it didn't go any further. So far I've been the kiss of death of these things, but there you go. So, but just one other thing I will say is that, so we're looking at options. LT were authorised to do some of these enabling works, and some get powers to, I think the powers the progress to try and get powers to build this as well. But it was, of course, the change of government in 1979. Thatcher government put a stop on everything. The LT in its discussions with GLC during the 70s had slowed things down, as I understand it, in terms of investment. So the brakes had come on, and there'd been a sort of enabling works, sort of flag-waving exercises, but it really had stalled. And of course, eventually it was the change of government that put the brakes on any tube extension down to the Docklands for them. But it's interesting to note that remember that sort of alternative transit system looked at by the GLC earlier was resurrected in 1976 by the GLC, working as joint committee with local authorities. So it was called the Docklands Joint Committee Study, 1976. They were looking at low capacity options, so busways, trams, light rail was resurrected, looked at. I gather they must have looked at the Travers Morgan stuff earlier as well. I said I haven't seen it, had a chance to read it, but it's good summary in the book I've referred to. But it concluded that busways are best, but that change of mode was still not liked. And of course, busways, you'll see there's some rail corridors that helped the development of the Docklands Light Railway. But it did still continue, the River Line was the best solution. And so it was progressed. So, onto a couple of factors now that helped progress the Docklands Light Railway as we know it. Excuse me. Right, so I think now we can free flow a bit more now because I started in 83. So the next one is creation of the LDDC. London Docklands Development Corporation. Michael Heseltine's Department of Environment, I think it's Department of Environment, just get it right, that's the, yes, was the Secretary of State. He set up these enterprise zones, not just for London, but also for Liverpool. So you've got these sort of planning, freedom of planning controls, and this, of course, went up to the Royal Docks as well, but these freedom of planning controls and enterprise zones where they had reduced planning sort of approaches and which helped developers, and they were keen to look at transport options. Heseltine appointed Reg Ward as the chief executive. I didn't have the pleasure to meet Reg very often, but he also had the vision of Ted Hollenby. Edward Hollenby was, I believe, an architect with the GLC before jumping to the LDDC. I did have the pleasure of working with Ted Hollenby, and he, as I understand, was a key driver for a transport link through Docklands, and he was a key driver for a highly visible transport link through Docklands. So we'll find out more about that later. So that was the key driver there, and as I just said to you, and they looked at engaging. And here's a miracle, and when you think of today's politics, and you've got a right-wing Tory body involved, you know, and we know best, so why would we trust existing road? Minor miracle is that London transport planners were engaged in looking at those transport options with the LDDC. And when I look back, personal reflections, I think, wow, and I think it's great. And there was a gentleman called David Catling, mechanical engineer, was the London transport person engaged in the sort of light rail tram options being considered, and the London Transport Civil Engineering Planning team were engaged. And it may be because we civil engineers in those days were familiar with producing the parliamentary powers needed. But in my opinion, it's a minor miracle that they were embraced still to work with the LDDC, and of course the GLC were very supportive at this stage. Okay, the next key factor is Tony Ridley. Dr. Tony Ridley came in as the managing director, interestingly, before the LDDC was formed. But of course, he was engaged and was supportive of the new rail thing. And he was quite adamant that he didn't want those old sort of, conservative, terrible railway engineers from London Transport to be involved, and wanted a complete new team. He, of course, had history with establishing Tyne and Wear, and was the driver behind the PTE and Tyne and Wear Metro. He then went across to Hong Kong, and that's a key thing that he went to Hong Kong, because Tony Ridley was keen to bring on the development of these rail options with consultants. And very much influenced by people who worked with him on Hong Kong, and we'll come to that shortly. I did have the pleasure of being introduced to Tony. He wanted to keep it very, very slick. David Catlin, when I joined. And when I started, it was David Catlin, Roger Jones, both mechanical engineers, and Ben Harding, more financial sort of engineering, but also mechanical engineering. Not one civil engineer except the planning team just being told what to do. And David Catlin decided that he should have a civil engineer who should support him. Hands up, I applied, I got the job. Hello, Tony, says David. This is Paul, our civil engineer. Of course, Tony Ridley is the civil engineer. Tony knows exactly what he wants. And he said, do we need him, David? Can we afford him? So, welcome to the DLR, Paul. That was my introduction to the DLR. It was within a week of us joining in '83. So, what happened next? The other key driver, of course, was there were lots of redundant railway corridors are in Docklands. So, this is the core at Poplar. So North London line coming in here. There's the London and Blackwall coming in there. I'm not going to talk about the history of them. You can look them up. And this is the other interesting one, the Millwall Extension Railway coming down here. So lots of formation and corridors were still there. So this is just a better drawing, really, to show. There's the London and Blackwall, 1840 construction, first railway in North London. The foresight of the Victorian engineers to put these railways elevated on viaducts. Same between London Bridge and Greenwich, of course. It was amazing, wasn't it? So that was a corridor. It was disused from here to here, and that's the North London line up there, which goes right up. And there were services one day before my time that went into Broad Street. And of course, I've put this in because it shows you the Millwall Extension Railway, 1870s, which closed in 1920s. But these were still open as sidings and freight lines until the 1980s. I think this had only recently closed as well as a siding. So there we are, lots of corridors and formations still around, which gave that opportunity, which could also be used as a bus route, busway. That was the thing. So the sort of infrastructure we had, famously listed viaducts at Limehouse Basin. This was taken just as construction had started. So listed structure, these beautiful arches and parapets there, and some of the lovely Hawksmoor churches that you'll see to this day from the Docklands Light Railway. So that's the Limehouse Viaduct. I think there's another one. This is one of the original two-span wrought-iron bridges with granite columns. I don't know what the design criteria is for granite columns, but there we are. But that was a very interesting structure that we had to refurbish. There's the sort of old snippets from the Millwall Extension Railway. Island Gardens station would be here. That's the original viaduct in the park. There's the original viaduct there. And one of my colleagues who helped me, supported me in putting this together is Neil Roth, who worked for Docklands Light Railway with me for a while. And there he is as we went for a coffee in Island Gardens to discuss some of the pros and cons. A few pictures. So this was probably late 70s. Still bits of track down at Poplar. All Saints Station is just up there. The depot, this is now part of the depot. So just a few pictures. I had lots more, but I decided we've got to get through to some of my anecdotes. There's the formation. So you see some of these are from my old slides, which I think is quite interesting. So there's the North London Railway going up to Bow, what's called Bow Church now, up there. And it's a really interesting thing here. Anyone's got any snippets about this? There was this structure built on top of the formation here at, I recall it being called Holyhead Close, but I can't find any reference to that on the internet. Just goes to show the internet's not the be-all and end-all of everything, but I'm sure it's called Holyhead Close. And of course, it was a bit of experiment by the London County Council, or GOC, to build housing over railway corridors to see what it was like. And of course, the railway had been generally run down as a freight line since the late 70s. There was no traffic really running on this when we took it over, and we got objections to the construction from people who bought houses on top of this. And well done to them. They got their act together, and we had to go to some efforts to sort of placate them and reopen the railway. Interestingly enough, this is part of the North London Railway works. I think whether this is, Works was one side of the rail. That of course, is the LT&S and the District Line. One side was the depot, and one side was the North London Railway Works. We had the option to have this land in the Docklands Light Railway and in the second bill, which I'll come to, and I lobbied that we should not give this away as the potential for expansion of the railway came, and they had a review and said, no, we don't need to move beyond Poplar. We think we've got the capacity at Poplar. We do not need this site that was the North London Railway. So that's just to get that off my shoulder. Sorry, one I didn't win. Of course, there would have been money associated with it. But there we are. So then, with my colleagues in the London Transport Civil Engineering Planning Department and the LDDC, they started to look at sort of options for running around. Just got to get my dates right on that. We talked about LDDC. And this was just looking at, as I see it, looking at options. So in the 1980s, around about 1981, looking at options. Quite a lot of street running. So we're talking about a tramway system. And I don't know how many know the East End, so Burdett Road, it's quite a wide road. So that was street running there. Certainly lots of options for street running, but it's interesting to see there was this option right across the docks. So I can only assume Ted Hollenby was pushing that, and lots of different options going around there. And interestingly, 2 or 3 options being looked at. I don't personally recall this one. But there we are. And Minories, of course, was the terminus of what we now call Tower Gateway. And this, here, I look at the place called Stepney East. Now, it was a station. It hasn't been airbrushed out. It's still there. But that, of course, was a 4-track railway up to Fenchurch Street stations up here. And I think I can't emphasise how helpful British Rail were in enabling the Docklands Light Railway. And right from there must be the board level will agree to it in principle, but the operatives, the people that I work with and fellow engineers, I can't say enough in praise of how supportive they were in the enabling works to help us take over some of their formation and build things next to their precious railway and overhead line. And there was a particular chap, I will say, who's passed on now, a chap called Des Willis, who was allocated to us, and he couldn't do enough to help us. And the management, I think it helped on reflection that the management of the civil engineering here was in York. And it wasn't in Stratford, and I think it helped, and they trusted us. And I think that is great. London Transport and British Rail working together. I can't say enough in praise of British Rail support for this. And of course, there would have been the negotiations about releasing the formation here. So that's how we were getting there relatively cheap, and one assumes that the busway would have used that as well. Okay, so at this stage, very much consultants would have been supporting Reg Jenkins' team at 55 Broadway. So there were a number of freight... Oh, so there we are, look at that gem. That is the engineering drawing for the loop round to Aldgate East. So I knew about that. I didn't know about that other one at Tower Hill, so I'm a bit sceptical whether that really did exist. But there we are, the single loop that went round, rather like T4. I worked on the T4 loop. And there, so it would have been access to the 2 platforms at Aldgate East there. And that would have been descending round about the area of Cable Street, where you've got the viaduct now, and similar to where the current descent to Bank is. So really, really interesting. Not going to dwell on it. So now the interesting thing was that, say, after those routes, there was a report done, 82 by GLC, LDDC and London Transport working together, fantastic, produced in June 82, and John makes a good point about this in his book. So the next iconic decision and support was that the report published for Digest, in June 82. In October 82, Michael Heseltine stood up at the Tory conference and announced that a light rail would be built for Docklands. Amazing, I say to you. Jointly funded by Department of Environment through the LDDC and the Department of Transport through London Transport, who then reported to the GLC. So who knows their politics? The LDDC, very much a Thatcher body, right wing, and the GLC very much in those days who was it? Red Ken Livingstone, a left-wing body. So that was interesting, and we had to have lots of meetings around those times. But so fairly swiftly into public consultation, and following, and those, the railway that was put into public consultation, so they'd abandoned the Aldgate East Loop, which on reflection is a shame, but of course where would that extra 50, God knows what, £1 million have come from? It was tight. So it was from a station somewhere in the vicinity of Fenchurch Street, Minories we called it. There's no doubt about it, because, and I stand to be corrected by members of the audience, but there was no doubt about there was some street running going on down here at that time. And of course, look, that was street running from, that's the sort of Bromley, Bow Church area is there. That was street running to Mile End. So that was what was authorised. That's what we started to produce parliamentary powers for, to build that railway. And that's the plan when I started in the office, which was based at Blackfriars at the time. And in 1983, summer of 83, I started. That was the plan in the office, with street running to Mile End, streetcars, so we'll talk about those briefly. And I remember talking about what sort of bridge we were going to, that's the Millwall Cut, for those are Millwall docks and the West India docks. I'm not going to talk about history, but there's a cut through there. And I remember talking about what sort of bridge and how we were going to get this lifting bridge with OLE on it, and trying to get that design into our designs and our design packages. So it was definitely option was still at street level here, and I think it must have been street level right down until we come to take over the old Midland, the old Millwall Junction. So that's going to, I remember that. It was this sort of trams that we were talking about. I had the pleasure to be sent to Nantes to go and see this, and Utrecht to go and see this. Fantastic. This sort of concept, that was a great railway tram system, Utrecht, very impressed. These were maintained in the same depot as the local buses. Everyone, David Catlin was very excited about this concept of maintaining tram cars and buses in the same depot. That was the sort of thing. Tony Ridley, of course, loving it as well. This is none of this sort of traditional engineering. Thank you very much. Let's crack on. That is the San Diego trolley. I couldn't understand why I wasn't sent there, but I did go and see it later on in life. My wife was not that impressed. I was. Oh, right, okay. So then the next key step. So now we're talking about, again, this is coincident with when I started, and so mid 83. And again, British Rail were really, really supportive of the development. Now, bear with me. I've orientated this. It's not easy to read, but it's this way on purpose. So north is up here. There's the North London Railway going up here, down Poplar down here. There's that tunnel and housing, the other end of it, there. Bow Church is there, as a matter of interest. So the original design was to come up here and go down the Mile End Road. Mile End Station's down here, okay? Now, there is this railway line here, which is a link from sort of Fenchurch Street up to Stratford. So Stratford's up there. I don't know who negotiated this, but amazing. And again, British Rail was so open to it, they allowed us to take over a whole single line from here to Stratford. And that was, it was a service limiter when we first opened, of that there's no doubt, but it was an absolutely amazing decision that they allowed us to do it. Of course, the engineering, Red Schenkin and the planners had to look for a geometry around here. I remember talking to the person who lived in that house there, persuading them, oh, no, it wasn't going to be very noisy, it wasn't going to be terrible, but look at the benefits for East London. And they were that's called, sorry, I can't remember, Hartfield Terrace. They were up there, and I think, they were very, very tolerant. Of course, there's a process to go through and us getting permission to build it. So that was the next real stage which enabled us to abandon. We got permission to use BR land to there. And then the second batch of powers enabled us to go from Poplar round to Stratford, and we abandoned the thought of powers to Mile End. So, and that then also enabled all sorts of other options to be considered in terms of railway. Right, so I just need to keep my eye on the time. We need to crack on. So, just as an aside, because I remember this, and it is an interesting snippet, and I found this picture. It's a pity it's not in colour. Would have been blue and red, I recall. But Of course, mid-'84, the Thatcher government had enough of the GLC. It didn't help the number of unemployed. Do you remember it? The number of unemployed, there used to be big numbers on County Hall opposite the House of Parliament. Considering the diametrically opposed client team we had, I thought it was really, we were making great progress on the DLR, but there was the writing was on the wall for the GLC. And I don't blame them, quite frankly. They wanted a launch event. So we had some enabling works on Limehouse Viaduct where we cleared the vegetation, did some what we call trial holes to look at the condition, and they made a big splash of it, and it was the last real sort of swan song for the GLC as far as the DLR was concerned. But look, this was the launch and they launched this sort of corporate image to go with it. Tower Hill, this was the image that was projected. I remember it well. There's some interesting names on stations there. Devon Street, I can't believe why we called it Devon Street. 4th Street was an optimism that we would be able to, and we were still talking driven tramcars, streetcars here. Whether there was any signalling, that's another thing. Limehouse was an extra station between Stepney East. Okay, so some interesting things. And some of the old names down here, Millwall Park, Glengall Grove, which of course have got different names now. So it was really interesting. But I had one snippet, can't resist a little snippet. I hope you're enjoying my little stories. But left wing and right wing, there they were together. And it must have been June '84. It was the day the Queen's Honours were announced, summer birthday honours were announced. The chair of the LDDC was Sir Nigel Brokes. Well, Nigel Brokes, actually, the morning before, that the day of the event, it was Sir Nigel Brokes. And Dave Wetzel of GLC fame was sent down to represent Ken Livingstone. And I'd never met Dave Wetzel before. This guy with a shock of white hair came up, slapped Nigel Brokes on the back and said, "Nigel, well done, mate." And you could tell that Nigel was like, "I've only got to suffer this for another week." Sorry, lovely snippet, but there you go. And that was farewell to the GLC. But I will say, thanks to the LDDC, I also thought at the time that would be a complete change and out with LT as well. But no, they ran with LT. I think that helped. But we ended up with this layout. That we were looking at in terms of going to tender, and it's very significant what we were doing. We were designing this railway with consultants, many based from the Hong Kong influence, which Tony Ridley felt very comfortable with. Some of them, whether they had tram experience, I'm not going to comment, but quite a lot of drivers, what we got from those Hong Kong biased consultants, so Arabs, Mosul were there, and also we had project management team who were Nichols, a chap called Mike Nichols, who went on to create Nichols Associates, and he project managed the Metro Camel cars for Hong Kong for Tony Ridley. So that was the link there, and I worked very closely with Mike Nichols. It's a small team that we had. There were 5 Nichols people managing this process to go to tender, and the politics with the LDDC and the GLC, and there was me working as the civil engineer and David Catlin with Roger Jones in terms of the engineering. So it was a tight, small team, and I very much enjoyed it. So we were going to tender for what we call traditional design by engineers. So that's the Arabs were doing architecture, Mosul's, Kennedy Donkin were doing the M&E, and it was getting expensive. It was getting expensive. I remember sitting in a meeting talking about which leg are we not going to build. I do remember that. And I sort of, because by now the LDDC were in control, and so I can't remember what happened there. But, well, I do know what happened next, and it's the fact that we had these potentials for ATO systems, and I know that the industry, away from our tender process, and I was very much following the tender process, and I was in that, and getting involved in the documents, but I know that system suppliers were lobbying the LDDC to say, we can build you a railway, you don't need anything to do with London transport. So once you heard these, I thought to myself, wow, have I made jump ship to the wrong job here? And these were some of the proposals that came in, and I've seen this in the back of a magazine, you can see I copied it, of some of the rail industry proposing design and build automated railways. And so this is the sort of, if you see it, the rubber-tired sort of Leo system, all right? Now, the other thing that I haven't told you, I forgot to say, is that when Hasseltine stood up, he said, you've got £77 million and it has to open in 1987. So we all knew that, the whole industry. That £77 million included my salary, okay? You know, so everyone knew that. And some of the bidders, including this lot, were putting in bids £80-odd million. So, you know, bit of common sense, I think, really. But the point is, they were lobbying hard, let us build your railway for you. We know better than London Transport. So we had this contract, we were about to go to tender, I remember, for this standard designed package out to contractors to do the construction. So we had civils and building contractors, and we had M&E contractors, and we were going to do the management of it. And I remember, I can't remember, but it was that summer, someone blew the whistle, stopped the job. We no longer were going for engineer design. I think it was something ridiculous, like 6 weeks. You will go for a design and build railway, all right? And it had a performance spec. I'm going to give a couple of criteria, but I can't remember the details of it. But the performance spec was basically that map. You'll have stations there. You'll have other aspects as well. But one of the criteria, and this has now been lodged in the LT Museum. It's not been thrown away because this is I've lodged all my stuff in the LT Museum, which is what's led to this talk. But the thing is that this is a very expensive signature because that says, it says here, so what we had, and I consulted when we put this together, we have a loading for the underground. It's called RL loading. Now, I won't talk to you for ages about it, but it's a type of loading that allows for most rolling stock that fits on the kinematic envelope and lighter loading than National Rail because we haven't got freight. It allows for a nice envelope to allow different cars to be designed for the tube. So we said, well, it's a light railway, so we went crudely for half RL loading and adjusted it accordingly. So it gave you an envelope of loading which allowed for different cars from different manufacturers and allowed us to perhaps lengthen trains later on and that sort of thing. Okay, this basically says the loading can be reduced below 0.5 rails to the loading that will accommodate the vehicles or of a similar step scale. But we had only asked for a certain performance criteria in terms of capacity. They determined that that capacity was single cars, and therefore the railway was designed for single cars at 8-minute headways. Boom! And that allowed them to do it. There we are. So, expensive signature. So, we had a performance specification, we had the contracts side, which was with the legal guys, and then all our good work done by the Arabs and Kennedy Duncans, which was what we really wanted, was offered as, you might like to use these specs. And where it suited them to cut corners, they did, and where it suited them because they perhaps didn't understand it, they just ran with what we'd said. So there we are. That's too much personal view there. I've done it again. What have I done? There we are. So, the selected package, GEC Molam, ordered at the end of summer 1984. So the Nichols team of 5, with 1 or 2 engineers supporting it, had got it this far. A minor miracle to turn that round in 6, turning round the contract, you know, pat on the back for me and the 5 or 6 others, and it hurts this and the legal team. You know, we wanted us to turn it round, issue a contract, and assess the bids. You know, and we awarded the contract by the end of the summer. Design and build, the overall cost was about £64 million, so it reflects my nice salary out of the £77 million. Automated, I was amazed when I heard it was an ATO railway. I was absolutely amazed. And linked to that, a low Conrail system. I was amazed. A new conductor rail would be allowed. Another group who enabled this and really, really helpful were HMRI, Her Majesty's Railway Inspectorate. Now we'd wisely brought them along and carried them. I remember having meetings on site with the LDDC rep and the GLC rep, I can't remember her name. There was a lady who was in the LDDC team, and we were out on the Limehouse Viaduct trying to negotiate with HMRI how we could incorporate a tramway on the viaduct and make room for it. And say, we thought we were going to have manual-driven trams, you see. And I remember saying, I remember someone saying, the HMRI saying, oh well, we've got to have, got to have 20th century standards, and we've got to have safe passing clearances, even though they're thinner and narrow track. So one of the GLC reps said, well, why can't the maintenance staff just step over the railings and hang on the outside while the train goes by? No. Oh, and I think the name Audrey comes to mind, but I don't know. Anyway, but the thing is, she also, another member of the team said, why do you need depots and sidings? But there we are, in this, when we were trying to sort of cut costs. But there we are. So we ended up with this automated rail, amazing. The HMRI were amazingly supportive. Of course, it meant automated railway, no maintenance work during traffic hours, and therefore it did mean that we could play about with low-level conductor rail systems, which is cheaper than overhead line. And of course, the LDC Ted Holland, big impact. And I think, double tick. At the time, I was thinking, oh dear, it's hard work. But what inspiration has been. He pushed the low-level Conrail system. You haven't got all that wire and knitting through the Docklands. I think it looks fantastic. So this is what we got. There's your capacity thing, 1,760 passengers per hour. That was, stated. To get that, they offered an 8-train service. We didn't ask for that. That's what they offered. Only 11 trains was what they needed. We were able to negotiate 15 new stations, so some stations weren't included. And including maintenance facilities as well. So, great. So there's the DLR project team. And a good-looking chap on the end here. I don't know why I wasn't wearing whites. I'm a bit of an amateur cricket player. But, I mean, there were 8 people who managed the delivery of this job. And it's not far away from my last job in terms of value of the Northern Line extension to Battersea. I was thinking there were 208 London Transport people on that job. But, and there's Keith Ware, who was brought in as the M&E sort of rolling stock signalling guy. Keith worked on the Victoria Line in the 1960s. What a contrast. Here I was, sort of early 30s, civil engineer, the only one who dared to show interest in anything beyond heavy rail, and I never regretted it, together. There's Keith, Man and Boy Railway. This was his last job, really, in the industry. Chris O'Hanlon, I'd like to mention as well, he worked with Reg Jenkin in the planning stage. God rest his soul, was also passed on. And he was a great support to me, and a civil engineer came across and helped us engaging when we were running short of staff and times. And he also had to do planning work back at the ranch. Fantastic, and a great knowledge of the railways and history. So a couple of commercial guys here, Colin Drew and John Portes, and Tony Howard there, one of the Nichols guys, was the only liaison person with all the people. And these two were our estates people, Charles Stimpson and I can't remember, Ian, can't remember his surname. So that was the small town. This is a ringer. He could play cricket. So there we are. And this is Millwall Park. The railway's over to the left there. And apparently that is where Millwall Football Club used to start. So construction then, I'm not going to dwell too much, looking at the time. Yeah, we need to move on. But this is where it really started. So remember that picture of that bridge with all the track there, which was only a couple of years before this. This is where it started. This is the depot site. I just show that because that was the first works. Lots of piling was going on there. I got excited, at least 8 different types of piling across the whole job. No, I'm not going to explain them all to you. But now just a couple of snippets. So look, Tower Gateway, Mineries Terminus, lots of enabling work. So some of these gantries here came over there. We had to shorten these, enabling works. We squeezed in the station between this car park here and the viaduct, thanks to my friend Martin Roach, who I was only on the phone to two nights ago. And when we were talking, I said I'm giving this talk, he sent me photos from the 1980s. Fantastic, you're lucky you've got at least a couple of his photos in there, which I need to arrange for the LT Museum to get. So look at that, lovely photo. I think that's me showing people round. But look at the way it's squeezed in. There's that, it's not that great a picture, but there's that city car park there. All these overhead lines were pared back. So, and it's the So fantastic tune. There's the Stepney East. This was about the time we did that LDDC GLC farewell party, and it was to clear the surface of this. So Stepney East, very much so. And when we were running out of cash, there was talk about, so you see what the BR did over the years is they slew the track. There used to be 4 tracking down in this area here. So it's only 2 tracking in those days. They moved it to 2 tracking to ease the curvature. And someone had the cheek. I mean, BR, I've always stressed how helpful they were. And some people had the cheek to go back and say, well, why don't you go back to the old tight alignment? And I said to them, don't push it up. So we had to build a new bit of viaduct here to avoid that old junction area. Okay, I hope that's clear. So here we are, progress. You can see the curvature going on for us to avoid those, the old alignment there. Fantastic. Just a little story about Charlie Brown's, which is, I won't get much sympathy, but excuse me a minute. So, unfortunately, Charlie Brown's pub, which is there, I guess I need only show one picture, but I found this old one. So 2 pubs in those days. But this was still a pub before we constructed. And all those viaducts in Limehouse had different, that I've talked about already, had different occupiers. And one of them was the saloon bar. Quite why the saloon bar was under the arch and not public bar, I don't know. But the saloon bar was underneath an arch in there. And the toilets were the other side. And we had to negotiate access with all these people. And the guy here was actually quite accommodating. I can't remember his name now. But we had to go and meet him. So we go and have a meeting. And he was a proud landlord, and he said, well, you must try my beer. I think it was Bass, I remember that. I think it was. He was a proud, and he kept his beer well, and it was a nice pint of Relo. So in order not to upset the person we're trying to negotiate, you'd have a pint. So the first meeting, I think we'd had plenty, and so we thought, next meeting we'll make it at 2:30. In the afternoon. In those days, some of you remember this, pubs closed at 3 o'clock. I'm sure they did, didn't they? And so we, at 2:30, at 3 o'clock, boom, 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 bolts go up, and rats. So there we are. I went straight home after that. But we did manage to negotiate access to the saloon. We boxed it out and safely kept people going to the toilet and refurbished. So we had to sort of repoint the arches and strengthen bits and pieces. Quite an achievement, all in that design and build package. I was very proud of that. But the shock of this really is that all this was demolished as part of the London Docklands Development Relief Road. And I don't know about you, but I think that's quite a nice little corner of East London. These bridges are quite interesting. You see what we did there? We retained the old wrought-iron girders under there. I'm very proud of that as well. Part of the package, and the GC Modem Group retain that. I mean, credit to them. But there we are. So there were a little anecdote. Oh, another one. One of the arches. The parliamentary process was you got your powers. People were allowed to get a solicitor, complain, or whatever, make representation. But we turned up one day. So then my job was to go knock on the door and say, OK, your time's up. You've had your 3 months' notice. We're coming in soon. And I remember turning up with Charles Stimpson, who was in that cricket team, and we knocked on the door of this guy and said, now, Docklands Light Railway, so we're moving in soon. OK, this is your final notice. And he said, what's that? I thought, what's this about? He said, well, he'd not seen any of the correspondence. No email or anything in those days. He'd not seen any of the correspondence, whether it had gone under the mat or whatever. And that was the hardest, one of the hardest. His family business had been in that arch since it was built. So, not one of my favourite moments. Right, sorry. What am I doing? Doesn't want to know. There we are. So then the docks crossing, Ted Hollandby's vision across the docks, amazing. The planning drawings from Reg Jenkins' team had a large roundabout there, as a matter of interest, with a number of stops on it. So I remember seeing the drawings, but we went for this delta design. That makes sense. That large span bridge was put in across a wasteland, which was to accommodate the future Northern Relief Road, which went straight through Charlie Brown's. But there we are. So, and look, not a lot going on there. This is, by the way, Canary Wharf. If you didn't notice. And this strip is where they landed an aeroplane to test the concept of the city airport before that was built and before these were built. Just before I started, it must have been 1983. That was so the short takeoff and landing happened. I was a bit gutted. I missed that. Anyway, there we are. So through Canary Wharf, no expense spared. We only took down the bit we needed. That's quite interesting. But fabricated steel girders with a concrete deck. I'm not going to dwell too much on that. And this was the standard sort of viaduct that was used. But these bits of viaduct are no longer there. Anyone recognise it? So this is down the Millwall Park area. That's Greenwich Power Station. So I thought it'd be nice to see those again. So good economic design by GC designers were Atkins. Very much told what to do by the contractor. Contractor design and build. Interesting concept. I was very much told what I couldn't change, and absolutely made clear. I mean, it was just, I was in a meeting and said, well, I think you might find if you did it like that, it might be better, as a railway man. Is that a variation? No. And it's just, sometimes some you win, some you lose. I lost quite a lot. But this was a standard rolled section from the rolling mill somewhere in the UK when we used to make proper steel, and a maximum size. So very impressed. Not fabricated girders like Dock Crossing. These columns, Molam had recently got a job Sidcup bypass near where I used to live, and I'm sure they were the same size columns and diameters. Shutters were used, and that's how they got the job. So there's a typical slab on top, direct fix. No ballast or anything on that. Lowered the weight on the structures. And then a couple of shots of Island Gardens. So Island Gardens was quite interesting Y-shape, wasn't it? Only built for single car, as all we needed at that stage. That's under construction. So we did have issues. And one day, I remember being woken up. We had an on-call system for just in case something went wrong. And then something did go wrong. Does anyone remember that? This was what they were doing when they were testing the ATO system. They were doing an aggressive test. Yes, that's bloody aggressive, all right. And if you were doing an aggressive test, wouldn't you do it somewhere a bit less conspicuous? Anyway, there we are. Put that one down to experience, shall we? So then going up the North Leg, that is the very last BR train that ran. And we ran that because there's that Holyhead Close, I'm sure it's Holyhead Close, with the buildings on top. And to prove to them that the railway wasn't going to be, we ran a mainline train, not a lightweight train, tram car type train. We told them, look, no, the noise is going to be all right. We had to do all sorts of noise attenuation measures in the tunnel as well. But we ran this train. And I remember, I was there, I probably took that photo actually. And I remember, and it was, because it was a public footpath, wasn't it? Everyone walked up and down from between Bow and Poplar on that. No cyclists, because the ballast was still there. And I remember a jogger went past, and, whoa, train coming. Oh yeah, pull the other one. And he ran into the tunnel. And then he came running out. And then the train came out after him. But the trainer had to put on an emergency brake. And so all the noise tests were done with flats on the train. So that was a little bit, and we especially had the wheels turned for that test. So that was a bit frustrating, but there we are, another little anecdote. There it is. Since I just thought it would be a nice sort of then, before and after. So that's the build houses on top and the attenuation measures. That's the old North London depot, which I would have had as the depot. Then track lane proceeded. Actually, this fancy bit of kit packed up after a while. It was second-hand, and they just basically laid it by hand after that. But it's a nice photo, isn't it? I remember that. But the other thing I remember was the ballast was delivered from the north, and the guys. So the ballast came down from the north. It must have come down from the north, yeah. But they took grass seed from the south up north, and I remember that. The first spring after it was open, there was a beautiful grass coming up. And David Catlin actually toyed with having grass forefoot, as we call it, between the rail for our street running trams to keep the noise down. And we did end up with grass seed on our railway, thanks to that round trip. But there you go. That's another story. So, Bow Stratford then, just snippets, but give you some of my little stories, really. These are called the leaning posts. I told you I was absolutely amazed we got permission to put an ATO railway next to a Dame-maintained railway. HMI was very, very tolerant. I did take a trip up there recently. There's now a fence down there. But the whole idea of this was that because we weren't sure what we were going to, we negotiated with British Rail that they needed a safe space for their staff to get away from their trains. The idea is that you stood between these with them and you knew that they were there, or you stood next to one of those and you were in a safe place. So the leaning posts. I think they were leaning posts when I left after about 10 years, but it's nice to see there's a proper fence along there now. So that doesn't surprise me. So I'm not going to dwell on the engineering, but we had some fancy bits of track work that I could get excited about. But just a little snippet here. That is South Quay Station. That's now gone. I remember talking about having a station over the Millwall Cut. I do remember it. First of all, I talked to you about, I remember having a lifting bridge. But I then remember when we went to this, could we change the position of South Quay so that it served both sides of the docks? We didn't. What have we got now? That's exactly what South Quay Station does now. Now it's 3-car, it serves both sides of the docks. All right. This curve, we had the powers to take that railway straight and then curve straight down the side of Cross Harbour. Okay. There was a building here which was a bit too expensive to buy, so we put in this S-curve there and the wear patterns. No sooner, I think, I'll stand to be corrected, I think whether it was the foundations going in the ground, probably the columns, it seemed to be the columns coming out the ground, and the development activity just changed overnight. This building, and the concept was that the old warehouses and 2-3-storey buildings were being converted into stuff. That was the concept, quite nice, some of it. But as soon as they saw the columns coming out of the ground, they were purchased and flattened. And so that building that was there was purchased and flattened. And, it's another one of those that got away. A shame, but there we are. So, then to the trains. I need to look up some statistics because I'm not really a train spotter. Some people might say, you're telling porkies there, Paul. But they're built in Germany. I didn't have the pleasure to go and see these in Germany because I was on the civil engineering side for this part of the DLR. But Linke Hoffmann Busch, LHB, we call them, is Salzgitter, Germany, based on a sort of standard tram car design at the time. Inward folding doors. So these doors sort of went like that. That's it. So they went like that. And, you really did get trapped in the doors if you stood on the standback like this and they came and, so there we are. So, but, that's the thing about D&B. So capacity, they were 28 metres long, single 3 bogies, articulated centre bogie, 28 metres long, capacity 84 seats, I'm told, 210 standing, 250 crush loading, and we tested that quite a lot in the first couple of years, crush loading, I remember, and I'll explain to you why. So, interesting, and there's stories about what happened to those, but that would be for a subsequent talk if you choose to have me back. I'm not doing very well, actually, am I? Sorry, I've got lots to tell, so I do apologise. So let's crack on. So the next thing was, I was stunned with this low-level Conrail. I have a section of Conrail from that original railway here, which I happen to find in my bedside cabinet. Too much information. But there it is. Now, I don't think there's any of this on the existing railway now, because that doesn't have the capacity for the enhanced service, so please come and look at that. But it's a co-extruded aluminium stainless steel with the wearing surface was the stainless steel. 750 volt DC. Interesting system, and it had this sort of plastic cover on. I remember, I think it was Christmas, January 88, Christmas 87. There was a huge downfall of snow in London. This was the only railway that was running for a little while, so that's quite interesting. And it's got this sort of shoe gear that comes up underneath, all right? So you've got this system. So instead of shoe gear sprung down like Southern Railway and LT, it's like that. It's shoe gear systems like that. Okay, I'm not going to go into more detail on that. I'm not really going to go in much detail about this, but the ATO system was, so I had these things called a DDL, data docking link in the car. Then there were these boxes, docking links, in the forefoot, that's between the rails, all right? And they were, the quality of the submission, I remember, they were painted with they were timber with a bit of yacht varnish, I remember it well. And then you had this thing called the wiggly wire. So there used to be one wire went down the middle of what we called the forefoot. The distance between the rail we call the forefoot. So one wire went down the middle, but every now and then they crossed over, and the other one ran down the running rail. Okay, and so I think the closer they got together was the slower probably it went, and the further apart those crossing loops were, the faster it could go. I'm not going to go into much more detail of that at all. So it had that, and that was sort of something to do with the speed control, but it also had safety in terms of signalling safety systems. But it also, and the train, these platform ground things were about 1.5 meters long, I recall. So there was a bit of tolerance in terms of it stopping. Come to more about that shortly. And that the reader on the train had to sit above that. Okay, so, but there was also an automated regulating package, all part of this ATO. More about that shortly. So, yeah, we completed a railway, very proud of it. Lovely photos. We had the 2 routes running, red and blue, with the blinds up there. Unfortunately, we had this never agreed to a royal opening of a railway, but we did, and of course we I thought very wisely didn't open it until we were ready. It was a month later. Never open a railway on a bank holiday Monday. I have never worked so hard in my life. You know, I think there were sort of thousands turned up on that. What should we do on a lovely summer bank holiday? It was a lovely summer when we commissioned this railway. I can't remember it, but it must have been, as you'll find out. So, it was lovely. So, there we are. That was a pie chart from one of my slides. £64 million, that was it, and some of that was my salary. So just a few shots of it. I do apologise if I'm running a little bit over. Are we okay to crack on? There's some really interesting stuff. So there we are, the absolute minimum width platform you can get, 6 foot, not 2 metres, 6 foot. And the HMRI allowed us to do that, squeeze it in. As you can gather, that's the only escalator we had, and lousy sort of entrance. It's not a very nice photo, but it shows the original sort of images. That's why I've shown that, really. So tailgate, I'm not going to dwell on it because there's lots of fun. But these, I'm just going to show you some of the interesting things. We took over quite a lot of track from BR. I think we must have taken over from Beaucurve to Stratford as well. But this was one of the key bits we took over from sort of London side of Shadwell right through to Limehouse, and that's where the new diversion goes off there, just to get round the 2 tracking outside. So, and we took over the track, and I understand that's, until recently, it was still being used, that track. So it's fairly straight, 110-pound flat bottom rail, and they did drilling to fit this in. And again, we didn't even have room for leaning poles here, or posts, so we had this rolling gain. Again, I was amazed we got permission for this. The idea here was that we had to pay for automatic train protection systems that they turned on if it detected a train come in for maintenance workers. But they had day maintenance while we had ATO trains, and the idea was that was the boundary. And if they really got stuck in this way, they could roll against that and not get hit with the shoes. So amazing. That track's been used until recently. I'll talk about track performance shortly on that. While we get so there's the depot at Poplar, not going to dwell on it. As I say, I want to get to some of the stories. Lovely Docks Crossing, that was one of the publicity shots around the Millwall Cut area, I think. But look at the scale of the development. This was starting to creep up, and that was just after it opened, or during commissioning. I think I took that one. But look at the scale of the development. So it's quite interesting, isn't it? You know, the highest block with these council flats. Very interesting. But there we are. That's the submission. A drawing from the submission of the GC Molam submission, and that's the station that was built. I think quite amazing that we ended up with this blue engineering clad brick lift shafts and not some cheap profile affair. So quite amazing. I was down at Cross Harbour research. Some of the original canopy bits and pieces are still embedded in at Cross Harbour, so that's quite interesting if you want to see what they look like. I was quite surprised to see some of that still there. So there we are, 1 or 2 pictures. This was a calendar that they issued. And look, use of I show these because these are no longer being used by the DLR. That's Millwall Viaduct. Again, more refer, those plates were put on by us to give it some stability. And this is the a new embankment that we built to get from Cross Harbour up to that. That, of course, has been excavated. This is now the portal to the tunnel to Lewisham. And another thing I'll show why I've included this is that we had this sort of square Toblerone thing for a while when the train describers, of course, didn't work. I think it was just an interim thing, but there we are. I bet there's not many pictures of that around. And there's out wrong with that. You just turn it round, it did the job. So there we are, just a few little things. And nice to see that in HO. There we are, lovely Island Gardens, which I was down at recently. Oh, look, there's a Docklands Light Railway van parked down the back there. We actually had a van painted in the same livery as the train car. Just noticed that. You probably can't see it. So this birdcage thing that was there, I've got my opinions about it, but it was a single car station, both platform faces, which gave us a problem with any potential for double car. We'll talk about that another time if you're interested. And there's a rather nice photo from slides I've got of a standard single car platform. This is All Saints Station, but they were all built like this, and I was quite pleased with that. The token sort of architecture bit really was, we had these curved canopies that was offered by architecture, so there was a curved circular equipment room. Well, lovely. And finally then to Stratford, which of course was straightforward, single disused platform, very little work needed. We took over the same track. The only thing, of course, we didn't have at Stratford was was access to street for mobility impaired. That was the one big selling point for the Docklands Light Railway. Every station was accessible. I'm sorry I'm going on, but I think these stories are really interesting socially. I remember all this thing about Canary Wharf and how it took off for the developers. But I remember being at Devon's Road one day, and some bloke, I said, this touches me. And the bloke said to me, he said, this railway is fantastic. He was in a wheelchair with his carer. And I said, oh yeah, he said, I've been stuck in Devon's Road for years. He said, I can now go to Stratford. And I thought, well done. And the GLC were absolutely pushing for accessibility for all. Well done, GLC, I say. Okay, so we did go for a lift here eventually. I was the project manager for that. Oh, that was a problem. It was extra and over. And we did eventually achieve it. It was not easy. That was right down the other end of the station, but it was a route. It worked. It's not there anymore. But there we are. Oh, finally, well, a couple of things before I get there. Finally, ticketing. There's another good-looking young man there. We fell out with a contractor over the ticket provision. They put in a bid. I don't know the whys and wherefores, but we basically, enough's enough. We didn't want what they offered. In those days, freestanding ticket machines in the open were not sort of proven, and we worked very closely with the underground ticketing scheme. What they advised, we didn't go to, was it Westinghouse who they were with? We went to Thornier-Meyer, but we developed these machines. But the safer option was rear access, and so we had to build these chambers and lockable and all this sort of thing. And then we had the interface with the buildings, and we had a comm system, totally independent computer in that operations room. Was it a right decision? It was hard work, I know that, and that is why I spent more bloody days inside these ticket machines on the opening day than ever. So there's lots more stories about that, but we're moving on. But the key about it is, it wasn't perhaps clear on that other pictures, we had separate ticket validation. I put this in, it's the best picture I've found. It's at Devon's Road, where we had as prominent as we could get. All you need is, it's only like a ticket reader, but we put these huge columns around them so that people had no excuse to walk past. And the idea was that you bought carnets of tickets, and they had to be separately validated, like Oyster really, but it was too early for the British public. They could not cope with it. And we paid quite a significant sum variation for these. I did make sure that one of these is in the London Transport Museum. It's probably at Acton somewhere, so you'll come to that in a minute. So what happened? What did we find? I'm sorry I'm going to have to sort of go quite quickly through this, because this is, but hopefully got a few stories from you already. But, you know, initial reliability was an issue. I mean, what do you expect? 1983-4, we placed the contract. 1987, we opened this thing. 3 years. Amazing. on reflection. That summer, an automated railway, that summer was quite dry and lovely. So, and then, you know, we did, of course, test it and prove it. I remember the contractor wanted his capacity signed off, that's 1750 per hour. The way to do that is you had to run a service. We had to shut the railway for the weekend to prove that he could run the timetable. But we need to move the people. No, it was not in their contractual obligation to run the timetable with people on it. We lost that one. They ran the whole railway for a weekend with no people on it, I recall, to prove that they achieved the, did I say 1750 per hour? Hey, but there you go. I'll come. So there we are. That's the key. Wheel rail performance, and I now know a lot more about it than I did then. And I didn't ask the question, you know, as others didn't ask, despite all our consultants advising us, you know, is that they insisted on this smaller rail section compared to the standard national rail section, which is used by Tyne and Wear as well, the national rail section. They went for this, and basically the wheels on the cars that came were incompatible with the 80-pound rail. And that did, and I can tell you, wheel rail performance and an automated railway, ATO, automated train operation, is absolutely critical, as is weather condition. We'll come to that. Noise levels on those viaducts, you still sample that to this day. Now, train bunching was an issue. So I talked about, so we got perturbations and issues, and what happened was that the service wanted, you set your daily programme, off it went, and if everything went fine, you had your trains that sort of, I think it was 8-minute headways, and that was the maximum you could do, and it was fine. But once the train got behind, it was constantly trying to catch up. And there was no ability to sort of say, okay, stop, reset from day one and carry on at 8-minute headways. And so in the initial days, you could stand at, you sort of clear the Docklands work, you could stand at West India Quay, because Canary Wharf didn't open initially, all right? The train stopped there, but it didn't open. That's because of software issues. You could stand on West India Quay, and you could see all the way across harbour, okay? And if you could not, on both tracks, and if you could not see a train between West India Quay and Cross Harbour, you went and got a number 13 bus from the commercial road, because that meant all 8 trains were somewhere running around following each other. And of course, if they were stuck at Bow, where you've got that long run to Stratford and back, no passing loop at Pudding Mill Lane in those days. And so the way they did it was they'd have to manually reset the trains, so which all affected this initial reliability. So there we are. We learnt about that. The folding train doors I've talked to you about. Ticketing I've talked to you about. The lifts was the other one. I mean, they were cheap lifts, but we did get them. They were cheap lifts. And, you know, if you want to go down in a lift, you naturally touch the bottom button to go down in the lift. Unfortunately, the bottom button, I think it must have been the bottom button, was the alarm button. So two people, we only started with 2 people in the control room. You know, there were ticket machines not working. Every lift button was being pressed because people thought they were going to the bottom. So, you know, a simple thing, we put a sticky thing on it, and so, you know, up, down, alarm. So, you know, but there you go. And every now and then, because of this manual operation, every now and then, we did get 1 or 2 gapping problems with this, because of the conductor rail gaps, you know, so we did have 1 or 2 problems, not so bad, and 1 or 2 issues with the track components, so I'm not going to go. But finishing on a high, we did recruit flexible local staff. They had salaried staff, so there was no cash around. They quite a lot of them were train captains, is what we called the operating staff. They're flexible. They would do platform duties, train duties, engineering people. We had power supply people working on track, and track working on power supply and buildings. It was the dream for a manager. And so we would go, I do apologise. So, early enhancements then, signalling power supply resilience was an embarrassing issue. If you don't put it in your spec, you don't get it. And so I remember the coffee machine at the central depot blew a fuse one day, and it took out the whole depot. It did. And the signalling system was on the same power supply as the coffee machine. And it's true. That was the first thing we did, was put an uninterrupted power supply in for signalling. That was another £1 million that we had to find. Lift labelling I've talked about. Control technician, a technician in the room, to answer queries, because obviously it wasn't operating perfectly. This is the key one, damp weather control. So we opened it in August. Have you all heard of September morn? Yeah, that dewy sort of thing on it. Oh, perfect timing, open the railway, everyone's slapping themselves on the back. And then first trains of the day were sliding through the stations. That little wheel rail interface, if take anything else away from it today, is critical for automated train operation. Perfect for train in tunnel like the Victoria Line, but here, out in the open, it was key, we learned a lot. So a good, simple solution, first train round in manual, also meant that the staff actually had to drive a train every now and then, which helped with their awareness for recovery. Gates and mirrors, because we were now doing far more manual driving than we really wanted to. But, and strange this, how we forgot on an ATO railway to stop people just wandering off the end of the platforms. So simple, but a little bit of money, wasn't in the original code. Removal of validators, so we took them away, made them in line with the main underground ticketing system, although it wasn't actually quite. Originally, they had their own ticketing system before we were embraced by the rest. Noise levels I've talked about. And congestion at Tower Gateway, because it was very tight on those platforms, very tight, and lots of people, construction workers coming in when all the construction activity took off. But there we are. And as I say, when the construction activity took off, so then was more. I'm not going to talk any more about that. You may not wish to have me back. I've gone well over. I do apologise. But I thought I was going to talk about 10 years on DLR. I've only talked about 4 years on the DLR. I can give you another talk about my experiences with the extension to Bank. I've got colleagues who worked on it. I'd love to tell you about that. And of course the Vector extension. So, what do we think? Well, it is a nice view, or was a nice view, but what do we think? Are we proud of that? Am I proud of that? I am proud of that. I used to live in a place called Swanley. Yeah, some people do live in Swanley. And you could look up the A20 and you could see that building. And it was right in line with the A20 at Swanley. And I used to come through the town, look up there, and I think, I helped build that. And I do feel proud about that. So there we are. Thank you very much. Thank you.
We've got time for a few questions. So if anyone has one, would you raise your hand also? We've got one right in the centre there. Wait for the microphone if you don't mind before we...
That picture, by the way, is a Cuneo painting that GEC Molan had produced. And I don't suppose there's many of those around. And I have a print of it. So it was on a calendar for a while. So I'm quite blessed on my poor wife has to put up with looking at that every day.
I think it's an amazing achievement to do that between 1984 and 87. You mentioned flexible staff. Did you have any trouble with the unions getting it done?
Yeah, thanks for that. I can't remember. I don't think initially we had unions, but we did obviously have to get a union eventually. I don't think we had one straight away. I remember it being first discussed and some of my colleagues sort of frowning a bit about it. I don't know what Tony Ridley thought of it, but so I haven't answered it. But of course, I think you do. There's a time and place for everything, and I'm not particularly a union basher, although some people might. I used to be a union rep, actually, many days with TSSA. But, so I can't really say much. I don't think we had a company council, and I was one of the management reps on the company council. And I'll give you a little, can I give you another anecdote? Tower Gateway got really busy and the reliability issues were up and down. And I remember turning up at Tower Gateway, and of course I used it. Of course, you're the manager, you use your railway. Of course you do. And I turned up at Tower Gateway, and there was a guy just chewing the ear off the train captain. No, bloody useless railway. And I remember, I said, I don't know if I had a meeting or what. Probably did. Probably an important one. But I said, excuse me, sir, I'm one of the managers. Would you like to share your problem with me? And I said, let's get the service running. And off we went. And that went, there were, so 8 trains in service, small railway, and that went round the company just like that. One of the managers supported the team. And I'm proud of that. And we were quite good at that. So I felt the company council worked quite well, but I think as it expanded, of course, union And I think, when did I leave? 1993. The DLR was transferred to the LDDC because there was the performance issues were coming to a boil, and Thatcher government wasn't happy, and one of the solutions was, well, let's get rid of London Transport then. I'm amazed it took them so long to do that, but fortunately, I benefited from that. Does that help?
Any further questions?
Oh.
Got one in the second row.
Not a question. Just thank you, Paul. It brings back so many good memories of working with you on the DLR. My favourite. Is that working? My favourite thing about the DLR, because I was partly responsible for putting the planning together, and was that report of 1982 we put together with the LDDC. I was working with the GLC at the time. My boss went to this meeting. My boss was David Bayliss. With the LDDC, I think Tony Ridley was there as well. Michael Heseltine was there, and David Howell, who was the Minister of Transport. And David, my boss, came back and he said, I think we might have this. And I said, why? He said, well, Michael Heseltine wanted to go ahead with it. And David Howell, Department of Transport, didn't. And he said the Department of Transport officials, he said they were hiding under the table. They didn't want to be seen. So Heseltine said to Howell, I'll give you 3 weeks to make up your mind. And much later, at a conference, I actually put a question to Michael Heseltine. I said, well, he was Lord Heseltine then. I said, how did you persuade government to go ahead with it when the Department of Transport didn't want to? And he said, I announced it at the Tory party conference.
Yes. Thank you, John. That's John's book, by the way, and it's a good read. Thanks for that.
Any final questions?
I remember when I worked at Newham Council, when the DLR was first built, about Pudding Mill Lane.
Yeah.
My memory now is a bit sketchy, but there was one stage it wasn't going to open. Then it was only going to open if we, the council, put some money towards it.
Yeah,
is that how you remember it as well?
Well, it was not affordable in the D&B package. We'd identified there was going to be a station there, and a simple station. I think a simple station was built initially, an island platform with passing loop, and but we hadn't got the land provision for it, and I think we had to do an extra parliamentary bill with. And that's part of my sort of next talk, if you want to hear it, is about how it expanded, and including Pudding Mill Lane. But yeah, indeed, Newham were not happy because they weren't getting a lot. We had issues with Newham about Beckton, of course, and we can talk about that another time. Absolutely. But
I do remember the council putting money in towards the station.
I think, yeah.
It must have been presumably some sort of
So we did.
agreement around that.
So we did in sort of the short-term expansion, put in a pass. I think we initially put a passing loop in without a station. I'm sure about that to get capacity on that Stratford length, and then we did put in a relatively simple station. There wasn't much demand there, though, was there? So that was the issue, and of course now it's got quite a grand station there now, isn't it? I was quite surprised.
It's got the Ebbutt story there now next door to it.
Got time for one more? We've got a question back.
You mentioned in the planning process that street running was considered for a while. Obviously, if that had been chosen, we'd have a very different railway today than the one we actually have. At what stage in the process was street running rejected and the decision made to go to Stratford instead of Bow? And was the decision to go for an ATO railway taken at the same moment, or did that come later?
No, definitely. The ATO decision was definitely not linked to the route. I stand to be corrected. You might say something, but it was. So when I started, it was, as I say, street running to Mile End, and someone in the background was having negotiations with the fantastically helpful people at BR. I mean, I asked John, do you know who that was doing those negotiations? No, but BR were really, really helpful to release those tracks to Fenchurch Street area, and I guess in the dialogue it must have come up. And so that then enabled, I mean, that then enabled us to have a more standard light rail sort of time and wear PTE type thing. But we were definitely looking at driver trams, and I think we would have preferred a signalled light rail car system, and that enabled us to have a signalled railway, which helps your capacity, see, because of street running. So that definitely happened just about as I started, as I say, mid-83. And then we then geared to do, because we were about to go for powers. The first batch of powers was Tower Gateway down to Island Gardens, I recall, including that circular roundabout thing. That was the first batch of powers. We actually placed a contract for all this D&B before we'd got the second batch of powers for this northern leg, wherever it was going. But before we went to tender, this was the key, we'd got this bow curve thing, talking to these people, Hartfield Terrace or something, and that enabled this sort of operating railway with signals and greater capacity. Tick. Perchance, it enabled an ATO railway. Right? And we weren't thinking ATO railway at London Transport. I'm sure we weren't. We were thinking overhead line tram type system. I talked about Utrecht and what was it? One in France there. And that's what we were looking at. It was the bidders who saw the opportunity to sell their wares. At that time, there were quite a few automated railways around. There's one called SkyTrain in Canada, UTDC, I don't know what that stands for. They were lobbying hard for their cell, big cell, get into the UK. That French system, I think they were keen. And of course, they had an open door with Reg Wald and the LDDC. And I think it must have been touch and go where the London Transport were abandoned completely at that time. It must have been. And so we would, as I said, we were mid-84 as we were going to tender. It was that change of tack to go for a design and build. We had not asked for an ATO railway, but they offered the ATO railway. Amazing, I say to you. Oh, and
The key thing was that the Ted Hollenby didn't want to have overhead wires going along that route. He was adamant about it. He said, you've got to have a railway without overhead wires.
so, and the bidders were talking to the LDC, weren't they? Behind the LT back, I'm sure they were. We heard about this. At one time we honestly thought we might get laid off. I remember that, thinking I jumped the wrong ship. Yeah, thanks. And at the time I might not have been so praising of Ted Hollenby, but looking back, I mean, you dealt with him, didn't you? I think what a visionary to push for that. Thanks, I didn't realise he pushed so hard for that. So the bidders knew what the LDDC wanted, and the bidders realised they were the people really pulling, especially with the demise of the GLC, of course. I know. I'm not saying we did what we were told. It's amazing, as I say, that London Transport still had a key role. And I'm really pleased to have worked with the LDDC and the nickel scene. As an LT public servant, as you see, I worked with that team in the planning. So there were sort of 5 nickels and me, David Cat Ling and Roger Jones and a couple of others. Bob Bayman, by the way, came in to be the sole operating advisor, with the odd sort of trainee coming to help him, you know. So there we were, and we were sort of given this package to manage. London Transport were very slow off the mark. GC Molan were off. Well, what do you think? You've got to start in October 84 and you've got to finish in sort of around about October 87. They were off and running. They had to set up. A couple of people, like myself and another, with continuity of service. And we were nursing this baby. And I'm not a project manager. I'm the engineering. And the GC Molan people were on us. Oh, a decision on this, a decision on that. Blah, blah, blah. And one mistake TfL made was they didn't appoint their project management team until the Christmas, I recall. And because GC Molan were off. And I'm sure Tony Ridley must have been fighting hard for Nichols to get continuity. And there was a lull for that valuable 3 months. But eventually Nichols did win the day. I'm sure Tony really backed him, and absolutely so. I fully supported that. And they, as I say, had 6 people that worked in that. But two London Transport. But I was seconded into that Nichols team. Imagine this today, or back then, imagine this, a London Transport employee, I was interviewed by a consultant for my job. I got the job.
All right, thank you very much, Paul. A round of applause again for Paul. Do keep an eye out on the schedule for our next set of talks. I'm sure we'll welcome Paul back at some point. That was fascinating. I am about to head off to the DLR to Heron Keys, so I'll be sitting on the front watching that. Join us again next time. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you at the next event. Thank you.